Okay, so we are back talking about She-Hulk. I haven't reviewed She-Hulk in a few episodes. Long story short, I went away for 5 days, missed an episode. Turns out I didn't really miss too much, but today, oh man, we need to talk about She-Hulk because Charlie Cox returns as Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil. Now, I'm sure many of you are quite big fans of Netflix's Daredevil or just Charlie Cox in general, and ever since we saw Matt Murdock appear in Spider-Man No Way Home, we've been wanting to see a little bit more of him. Obviously, seeing such a small preview of him in No Way Home, he seemed similar with Hawkeye. We got Vincent D'Onofrio's Wilson Fisk, and albeit he was a bit more on the Hawaiian shirt side of things, which was true to the source material, I would say that his demeanor was similar enough, but there were, I would say, larger changes in certain other areas that made people perhaps a little bit concerned. Is Matt Murdock going to be altered to a very, very MCU side of things? And that is exactly what we're going to get into in this episode, because just how well did they pull off Matt Murdock now that we actually got to see his Daredevil in the MCU? I mean, yes, we've technically seen him before, but now we actually get to see what it's like fully fledged, giving us a tease of what is to come, of course, with Daredevil Born Again, of which we're getting 18 episodes of. So I'm going to dive straight into this, recap the events of the episode, break down a few bits, and most importantly, talk about Daredevil. Go ahead and give this video a like if you want to help support this channel. It is the best way to do so. But let's start off with those crooks stealing that of what they thought was an OLED or OLED TV, if you will, but it turned out to be an actual LED TV. And that is when we had frickin' Leapfrog come out of nowhere. Now, you know, obviously She-Hulk is, you know, meant to be a sitcom, and that's one of the biggest talking points of today's review, with how, you know, some people are complaining about certain parts when it comes to Daredevil perhaps, but this beginning part was kind of what I expected when it came to Leapfrog. We were cutting to scenes of Leapfrog, Mr. Patilio talking to Jen about making a case against Luke Jacobson, who designs these suits, as he does in the source material, because he claims it's like a manufacturer's defect, which She-Hulk definitely goes along with, but she didn't really know the full extent of how he didn't follow the manufacturer's instructions, which kind of does remind me sometimes of, don't get me wrong, I've had my fair share of freaking defects from manufacturers, but sometimes people might buy a product, break a product, and then be like, I want a refund, and scream in the store. You know what I mean if you've worked in retail before. Now, he jet up in the air with some jet fuel, quite literally, and he landed from quite a far height. If you want to get a little bit nitpicky, for some reason he didn't break his legs here, but he did, jumping out that window at the end of the episode, of which I looked at that scene. It seemed like a similar height, if not a shorter height, to when he was jetting off in the air at the beginning. But again, I know a lot of people don't care for nitpicks. She doesn't want to handle this case, arguing a conflict of interest, but, you know, we have Holden Holloway saying that there is a conflict waiver, so ultimately she has to try and navigate this episode, which leads to probably, I would say, a lot of people, including my favorite She-Hulk episode yet. Probably easy to say given Charlie Cox, and again, that is the main vein of discussion that we're getting into today, which is when we cut to court, and we have a bit of courtroom rivalry between Matt Murdock and Jennifer Walters. Now, I did quite enjoy this. On the bottom line, the biggest defense that Matt Murdock makes before the judge is that Luke Jacobson makes suits for superheroes, and that also another cool reference here is that the Sokovia Accords have been repealed. So as a result, making suits exclusively for superheroes and Jen trying to get access to his previous client records would completely screw over that anonymity, but also in how he's trying to protect his own ass here, because Matt Murdock is of course a client of Luke Jacobson because he has made his Daredevil suits. Now, we all know about the Sokovia Accords by now within the MCU. It essentially allowed superheroes and their identities to be monitored, thus their identities not really being so secret. But now, like, it's reversed. So ultimately, the judge agrees with Matt Murdock here. But this was the interesting part of the end of the case in court. We have frickin' Leapfrog pull out his suit, and Matt Murdock uses his enhanced sense of smell, and he asks what fuel he used in the thrusters or boosters of the Leapfrog suit, and he said jet fuel. And again, going back to what we were discussing earlier, that was not under the manufacturer manufacturer's instructions. So ultimately the case is completely void, and Jen feels like an idiot because her client didn't, make that transparent to her when prepping for the case. And so this is where the chemistry really picks up between Jen and Matt Murdock, and ultimately we get to see a bit more of, we're literally watching Matt Murdock in the MCU. So is he samey here? Now initially he buys a drink for Jen, they get into some discussion about his work, which is really cool because he says that he has a practice in Hell's Kitchen. He says we mostly do pro bono work, so obviously, hopefully referring to Foggy when we get Daredevil Born Again. There's been rumors surrounding how certain actors may very well be reprising their roles. And even Jen's just like, it's not just me who's feeling, something in the air here, right? But that's when Matt gets a call, and it's essentially to go after Leapfrog because he, as we found out a bit later on, kidnapped Luke Jacobson. So you could clearly tell that he wanted to carry this on, maybe take her out to dinner or something. But in a very vigilante way, he gives up what he kind of personally wants to do here to go out in Daredevil crime fighting mode, which kind of leaves Jen thinking, oh, is he kind of not interested? But then of course it leads to her finding out that the very person she was running after was the man she was just kind of fancying in the bar. Now I would say in Matt Murdock mode here, I had zero issues, like from the courtroom to talking to Jen here. I know people are going to be like, really, please say psych or something like that, but honestly, like, no matter how you feel about She-Hulk, and no matter how you feel about the quips, and we're going to get into that in a second, I feel like Charlie Cox is what makes this work, even to the Daredevil extent of what we're about to get into. You may not like this bit, you may not like that bit, you may think the jokes are bad, you may not like even how Daredevil may have been represented in a couple of ways, whether that's his suit colors, which is more of a tribute, of course, to the classical look as well as the Netflix look. But overall, just specifically and initially talking about Matt Murdock here, I'm happy with that. And I think a big props to this is Charlie Cox. But then again, I do want to mention Wilson Fisk in Hawkeye. Yes, there were some changes, probably and arguably bigger than what they've done with Matt Murdock here, but Vincent still gave the demeanor of Kingpin. So I'm happy to say here that Charlie Cox still very much so brought Matt Murdock. Yes, the Netflix series is more gritty, more grounded in a certain way, especially when we're about to get into talking about the acrobatics and the more comic book feel here of, I guess, the more far-fetched acrobatics versus that of the Netflix series. But yeah, like, final word on this, very happy even with just the bar scene, the courtroom scene, and it does give me some optimism for the Daredevil Born Again show. I'm not talking about writing because, writing could be completely downhill. I could really enjoy it, but then they might have really bad writing in episode 6 or 7. But ultimately, the most important thing that I was looking for here with the return of Daredevil on live action and now in a new universe, the MCU, does it feel right? Or at least, at the minimum, am I happy with this? And I looked at it and I was like, yeah, I'm not saying the writing of the show and the future is going to be amazing, but the portrayal, yeah, that's Charlie Cox Daredevil right there. Now, before we get into more of the Daredevil talk, we have Jen go meet frickin' Todd. There are many theories surrounding Todd, as many of you may know, with regards to how he's probably one of the Wrecking Crew members who tried to spike She-Hulk in the arm to try and get her blood, but it just blunted the needle. And then we have that vibranium version of the needle, and lo and behold, he's talking about a Wakandan spear in this moment. And then, especially when you look at the end of the episode, I think a lot of people are right in their theories with how Todd once again was under one of those masks of the intelligentsia people recording in the background. I mean, I know they hijacked the screen, but you had those guys in the masks, and then one of them, of whom She-Hulk held up, that will probably be unmasked to be Todd. This whole seed of She-Hulk's blood has been planted right at the beginning of the show, of when we had Hulk really emphasize the importance of destroying her blood, even though it's very unlikely anyone could utilize the abilities from the Hulk blood like we have Bruce and his cousin Jen do, because they share the same genes. Other people might not be able to do that, but even if there's one millionth of a chance or whatever, other people could create a terrible army of Hulks if successful. And ever since then, we've had that storyline trickling along. So getting into the finale next week, there's probably going to be very big developments there. And so we have Leapfrog ring up She-Hulk, and he's claiming that he's under attack or whatever, but we didn't quite know at this point that he had kidnapped Luke Jacobson. And we have Daredevil on the car. Again, I don't know if you know this, but I had Daredevil comics from ever since I was a kid. Probably really started my fandom for vigilantes over superheroes. And don't get me wrong, I love superheroes, and I know there's a debate, and some people would be like, but Batman is a superhero and whatnot, and you could argue Daredevil is because he has enhanced hearing and whatnot. But my main point is I have more of a love for vigilantes. Seeing them on a car like this, hanging on and, bursting through the roof with their fist, that right there is what does it for me. And so we get She-Hulk arrive. She stops the car. Daredevil is kind of sprung off, has to do a flip. He says, you need to back off. I love that camera shot of when he looks behind. Now, let's talk about the suit, because this is when we get that pan to the suit. I know people have mixed feelings on this. Personally, I don't hate it at all. I don't absolutely love it, but I would say that I quite like it. I like how it is a take on the classical colors. There were certain shots in this episode, like I would say here, where it looked a bit more dimmed. I wouldn't say I wanted to go to the opposite spectrum and where it's too saturated, but here it kind of looked a bit more downplayed, bland in the night shots. But for example, when they went to the lily pad layer of leapfrogs, when we had Daredevil in the background, taking out people while She-Hulk was just kind of walking up to Luke Jacobson, his yellows in it looked to pop a little bit more. Now you could say that that's obviously a bit more saturated, but it looked a lot better there to me than what it did here. Overall, without rambling about this too much, I like the look. Obviously, it is almost a clone of the Netflix suit with some design differences in the armor, but the biggest differences being the color scheme. But let me know what you think of that. I thought this looked fine. Now let's talk about the next big thing. Now that we have Daredevil over in the MCU, similar to Wilson Fisk, not really, but at the same time, with the changes. There are changes in, for example, what I didn't like with Wilson Fisk. As far as we know, he isn't or hasn't taken the super soldier serum, yet he does not die. He has a freaking explosive arrow that blows him up, doesn't die. Gets hit by a car, doesn't die. Like, he is invincible. I don't like that. It's just, where's the writing here? Like, what's going on? Fair enough, if he does have the super soldier serum, yes, some people may say to me, but Wilson Fisk is very strong in the comics. Yes, but give me some explanation here. I can't just be like, oh, that's what they want you to do sometimes with shows and movies like this. Don't ask questions, but to me it's a bit lazy if you don't get into it. Now, Daredevil here, some differences. Now, we know in the Netflix show he is very acrobatic. One of the biggest praises of the Netflix Daredevil is those fight scenes, but the thing is they ground it a bit more with a bit more of a human feel to it. Yes, he has his hearing and enhanced senses, but at the same time, you don't necessarily see him as acrobatic as what you find here. Now, personally, I was quite a big fan of this, and it's also expected. In the MCU, if you're going to bring in Daredevil, or if let's just say it didn't start on Netflix and you brought in Daredevil in the MCU in the first place, when we saw him leap off the roof and we saw Jen look over and how he was somewhat steadying himself down each level of the car park, but in a very swift manner, that is comic book Daredevil to me. There was a certain fluency to it, which, again, I'm not saying it's better than Netflix's Daredevil action, because that is its own thing. Again, there's this very gritty, toned down realism to it in a way. Here, it's still Charlie Cox Daredevil, but it's just, okay, there's no other way to put it than MCU. Like, they've MCU-ified it, but in a decent way, in my opinion, with the acrobatics that make it leap specifically more from the pages, not overall, but more from the pages of his abilities, which ultimately, to say one more time, is probably the most expected thing if you bring Daredevil from Netflix into the world and canon of the MCU. Let's talk about the jokes. I know some people don't like the quippy Daredevil remarks where he says, my arse remains unwhooped. Maybe an unpopular opinion to you watching us right now, but to me, I'm okay with that. First and foremost, expectations are dialed in. This is a bit of like a roundabout conversation here, to be honest, because there's so many things I could touch on. I expect it with a She-Hulk sitcom. Like, if you're bringing in Daredevil, we expected stuff like this. But how about on this other side, that in the comics, Daredevil does make jokes. Even in the Netflix shows, there are deliberate, corny jokes that are self-aware. Like, he even says, okay, that was a bad joke. So this, I feel like people, I'm not saying everyone, it's just with maybe a lot of people not liking She-Hulk here and there, it's an easy thing to pile on with, oh, they brought my boy Daredevil, Charlie Cox, Matt Murdock, and look at what joke they gave him. I get where you're coming from, I do, and I'm not saying everything you're saying is not valid, but I feel like this one is okay. He makes jokes, comic book Daredevil makes jokes. That one was a fairly standard one. I'm not saying I laughed at it, it was fine. Just, I feel like some people need to not overreact there. If that was every 3 or 4 minutes, I would be like, fair enough. I think the CGI was a bit dodgy, by the way. I don't know if anyone else noticed this when she lifted Daredevil up to take his mask off. There was something a little bit off there. I'm not so much a big fan of things, and this is maybe the nitpicky side of me. When she was going to throw the car at him, so was she willing to murder this man? That car was literally going to land on him. Not to mention the property damage here, the car park. Okay, I can understand if you're in a proper supervillain battle, or even this one, I can understand that you're trying to do a public service as a superhero. Sometimes that comes with just damage like this, especially if you're a Hulk. But then just like picking up that random car, is that necessary? You're She-Hulk, you could probably stop him in another way. But again, I know that alienates some people when you point stuff like this out. But technically, within the writing of the world, if you want to be critical and do a review, I feel like I do need to take some things like this into account. As for Tatiana Maslany and Charlie Cox, like this moment when she takes his mask off, it's like, wait, are you pretending to be blind man? Because, that would be really problematic. Stuff like that kind of humor I enjoyed. Like, I'm not saying I was laughing off my seat, but as far as MCU humor goes, if you've been here for a while on the channel, I'm not always a big fan of it. I would say Guardians of the Galaxy James Gunn stuff works for me best, but No Way Home, I found most of the jokes landed flat for me. But here, it's just like, I found it like, okay, it was like, all right. I feel like the bit where he's like, I'm Daredevil. I didn't find that bit so funny, even though I did appreciate the Netflix theme there. We also have Jen dig into the ketchup and mustard color version of the suit. But yeah, I really, really, really like Tatiana Maslany. Okay, you should know by now from these reviews, my biggest bias towards this show, even though I like to be objective and still say that this show isn't that great, is Tatiana Maslany. I love her, and I love Charlie Cox. So we have a bit of a chemical cocktail here for me, and I feel like they do work well together. And what I will say is, from this moment onwards, when they're working together to save Luke Jacobson, I don't feel like they did a bad job of it. I mean, there are things to cherry pick here and there, but I'm overall talking about Daredevil mainly here. And what I want to go back to, now we can kind of look at this overview of Daredevil coming up next. They've brought in Daredevil, specifically Charlie Cox's Daredevil from Netflix. In these action scenes, we get another kind of hallway scene, which definitely was a bit of an homage to the Netflix hallway scenes. Not that it was shot in one shot or anything, but you get my point. Charlie Cox made it work. It may be different. It may not be the Netflix Daredevil. You might have wanted that to continue on for more seasons, but the reality is, and I'm not taking the bar at the bottom here, just being like, oh, at least we've got Charlie Cox's Daredevil still. I want to go above that. Like, I do feel like we've got Charlie Cox's Daredevil, and when they've brought him in the MCU, I don't think it's nearly as bad as what some people were worrying about. That's not me saying it's exceptional. We truly have to wait to see Daredevil Born Again before we really, that's 18 episodes. There's a lot of opportunity for flaws there. But here, the back and forth and dynamic between him and Jen, the combat that he did, like in that hallway scene, was really entertaining. I loved the extended baton on the chain. That was really good. I'm not saying that the choreography here was perfect. They did what they could, like, quickly. And Daredevil still had his Daredevil look. How he's just standing there, like, looking at the floor, just be like, bitches, come to me then. The backup came, and he was like, right, I'm ready for this. That is just a taster, I can imagine, of the severity and tone sometimes we will get during Daredevil Born Again. But as for the romancy kind of chemistry stuff, again, I like that scene when he was listening to the hearts and we just have Jen get really taken away with him. To me, it didn't feel forced. I think if it was another actor, then maybe, but I feel like Tatiana and Charlie Cox really blended well together with what was written for them, at least. I would say when they were saving Luke Jacobson, there's something I appreciate about going over the lawyer strategies between both characters when they were saying, look, Leapfrog, don't go further than this. Not that they care about him, but they were saying, look, if you don't go further than this, maybe we could argue a legal strategy in ways like this. And then we have Daredevil being like, well, actually, I think the best strategy would be like this whilst he's still fighting. I get why they wanted to do it. They're both lawyers. In a comic book, this would be written in the freaking bubbles. Like, I'm telling you now. But this did feel a bit too eccentric MCU for me. Again, the bias there was still tempering my cringe at it, I guess you would say, with regards to, okay, that's Charlie Cox and Tatiana. Like, they're both lawyer, superhero, vigilante mode things, alter ego at the same time. But yeah, it felt a bit too MCU when they were punching and punching. It's like, oh, the legal strategy. Maybe you found that hilarious, but I would say that was a typical example of what the MCU will perhaps do to a character like Daredevil. And I'm not saying what they will do to a character like Daredevil when they bring him in. I just mean, like, there's an example of Daredevil in the MCU of what they can do with the typical MCU humory stuff. It may be fine, but for me, that was maybe a notch too far, if you will. But again, still, that's not saying too much with how much I actually enjoyed from this episode. Then they're chilling at the lily pad sign, and then they go back to Jen's, have a good time. And so, end of the episode now, we get that little extra scene where we have Jen talking to us, the audience, saying, oh, what's this scene? And we, like, get a Red Hulk reference. She's talking about the twist that could be happening because the finale's next episode. And that is when we somewhat cut to that twist. We have the Best Female Lawyer of the Year award, where they kind of do a bit of a self-aware how multiple female lawyers won the award to somewhat just tick the boxes, if you will, which is when Intelligentsia popped up on screen and they were exposing She-Hulk. And I just felt like, what are you really exposing here? Like, I don't know, I was a bit confused because, I guess they were trying to defame her superhero image. They were saying that she doesn't deserve the Hulk power, she stole it from Hulk or whatever. They showed her phone screensavers of Captain America and his ass, if you will, her matcher profiles, like who cares if she's matching with people. But then it got like really messed up with what Josh did with, copying her phone and recording their time together. But then again, it's like all you're doing is exposing a superhero, I guess, for getting together with someone. So I don't really know if they were like going with that. The audience was like, oh God, how could Jennifer Walters, She-Hulk, do this? Like, but what's she doing exactly? Now, naturally, this made Jen really angry and it kind of escalated her, even though she has it quite under control, but the Hulk rage. So that's where you heard that like modulated rage voice. She kind of smashed the screen. People got scary thinking that she was going to lose control and hurt them. She went outside, grabbed one of the Intelligentsia people who were recording. I think one of them will be Todd, but that's when we obviously had those damage control soldiers with the sonic weapons. They got there very quickly, don't you think? Like, things like that. Also, attending the gala with that dress that Luke Jacobson, like, ripped. Did he just, like, work all night to give that to her for the next day? Do I have questions like that? Not really essential to the plot, I guess, but I don't know. And yeah, that's where the episode ends. So I guess the finale is going to be getting into really exposing what, the big behind-the-scenes thing is here. Wrecking Crew's boss, all of that kind of stuff. Intelligentsia, Todd, the vibranium needle, trying to get her blood. More or less just connecting the dots. So I'll have to say easily that this is probably the most entertaining She-Hulk episode. I feel like when they brought in Daredevil here, a lot of people had a lot of apprehensions, myself included, because no matter what, I do enjoy MCU, but I think people are fair enough to hold some reservation with regards to having other beloved characters join that universe, because sometimes it is too tonally different. They do write things to some fans absolute highest standards for them, but at the same time, there is a different standard for the MCU that sometimes changes a character to a bit too goofy, a bit too lighthearted, and things like that. But I will say that they made it work. Without repeating myself too much from earlier, I do feel like Charlie Cox made his character of his version of Daredevil be maintained mostly in the MCU, but with another cool aspect of that, he is a bit more comic book acrobatic now, possibly to an unrealistic aspect, because you could argue that when he was jumping off the roof and his arm was like, going down the levels of the car park, would that like rip his arm out of his socket? But then again, if you're highly trained and athletic like that and you were leveraging yourself down level by level, that would work. So I don't know. Let me know if you think the additional comic book acrobatics of Daredevil and She-Hulk, or should I say the MCU, is an improvement or not. Obviously, we really have to wait until Daredevil Born Again to see if the fight scenes level up to that, which I am doubtful of. I think we're going to get some awesome fight scenes, but I don't know if they'll be on the hallway Netflix level. Also, it's good to know that his appearance in this show wasn't just cameo for cameo's sake. For example, Wong, like, he didn't need She-Hulk to help him out. For example, that spell, as I criticized at the end of that episode where all the freaking demon things were flying through the portal, and he basically sucked him in. Why did you interrupt Jen having a good time? What I'm trying to say is he didn't need her for that case. That should have been down to the Masters of the Mystic Arts. Like, I don't know. Like, that's what I mean. That's where it feels like like She-Hulk doesn't always have such substance. But hey, look, Wong! But Daredevil in this episode felt like, oh, you know, there was actually something here that they gave a little bit more substance to and relevancy for Daredevil's Matt Murdock to appear in this storyline. But I have been rambling for far too much in this review, guys, so I leave the floor open to you. What did you think of this episode? But most importantly, the biggest question is, what do you think of Charlie Cox in this version of Marvel, in the MCU? Do you feel like they adapted his Daredevil well? Do you feel like they maintained enough of his characteristics of that of the Netflix version into this version? How well do you feel that translated from that to this? Did any of it alienate you? What do you think of the suit? What do you think of the more comic book fluency to his acrobatics? And also, do you kind of agree with me with regards to the quippiness, like how Daredevil can be like that, but I'm not obviously saying I agree with every single quip that they gave him. But I'm gonna shut up now. Like the video if you did enjoy this. It really does help me out, so thank you so much if you did that. But other than that, guys, take care, and I'll see all of you in the next video. Goodbye.